I was thinking the other day how, if you take a step back, right, sometimes, because we're so involved, and if you take a step back, you realize how absurd this entire thing is, right? How bizarre it is and how it wouldn't apply to any other context, right? Um, when we look at kind of the expansion of state powers, right? And the governments and the states attitude of divide and conquer, right? With our movement. It was incredibly heartwarming and beautiful to see how many in response came out yesterday in response to the 18th and to the government's continued attack on our movement. I always say our fight is never against individuals. I think we've very clearly seen how the difference between the two mainstream parties is only the color of the rosette that they wear on election night. And it's simply one's policy when it comes to Gaza. Our fight is always against systems. Our fight is against the institutions and every system that seeks to oppress and dehumanize and take away and strip any rights. And I think sometimes to that effect, when we talk about the increase, for example, of state legislation and counterterrorism legislation, for example, people often forget it was Labour that introduced the prevent legislation, for example, right? Yes, it was made a statutory duty under the Conservatives in 2015, but it was Labour that initially introduced it and brought terrorism legislation into our schools, healthcare, into all aspects of our society. And the beautiful thing about the movement that we have seen is, and partially why I think answer the question is why it threatens them so much, because it's become more beyond Palestine, right? And I always say, Palestine is liberating all of us, right? When you ask healthcare workers why they're protesting, or students, if we look at the SOAS encampment just down the road, why they're protesting, it's why are tuition fees being used, for example, to twin with Israeli universities that have been the backbone for the AI systems that are massacring people in Gaza, right? Why is the government, with its increased privatization in the NHS, using Israeli companies to supply healthcare facilities, right? And that's the sort of questions people are asking, and that's why we're seeing every section in society rising up, right? Why is it, for example, that the government made it a point to try and ban councils from divesting? Surely this question should be, why are pension funds being used to invest in companies that are profiting from illegal settlements and war crimes in Gaza, right? And again, this wouldn't apply to any other scenario, right? And when the government realized that it was failing, right? When the government failed to, for example, pass the anti-BDS bill, right? And in return, it saw an increase in councils divesting their pension funds from Israeli companies. What it seeks to then do is to target individuals and organizations, right? And a key, I think, point in this was two key points, actually. When Rishi Sunak came out and in front of 10 Downing Street just before the elections and had warned about, extremists within the ranks of our society. And if you didn't get the memo, that was us. And so, again, surely the question should be, this movement that's calling for peace and justice and dignity for the Palestinians, how can that be the national security threat, right? Why isn't the national security threat the fact that our government is greenlighting and willing to erode international order for a genocidal settler colonial system, right? Surely that should be the question. And so again, you think when you take a step back, you're like, how bizarre is this scenario, right? That students are being expelled for demanding that their tuitions is reinvested into their education, that healthcare workers are calling for no privatization, and even more so for the public funds that are being used to be invested into the healthcare system that is so badly on its knees, right? And then we see that through the government's continued rhetoric with migrants and refugees and asylum seekers, and how, for example, the video that Labour had put out the other day, where it was proudly showing that it was deporting refugees and asylum seekers. And again, you start to understand the only difference between Conservatives and Labour is the colour of the rosette that they wear on election night, right? Nothing more. It's the exact same systems, the exact same policies that we're seeing in place. And the second kind of big milestone, which I think really highlighted this, was when the SNP motion that was raised in Parliament, right, calling for a ceasefire, and because Labour was so unwilling to see what the majority of the British public saw, and because of the amazing efforts of countless and countless of people that were lobbying their MP. The only difference between the SNP motion and the Labour one was because Labour refused to put the word in collective punishment. And because of that, the Speaker of Parliament was willing to, again, erode democratic precedent within Parliament and allow the Labour amendment to go first. But what the key point was, when he got up afterwards, and when obviously, as rightfully so, MPs were demanding why he had disappeared, he said because he was scared and he was concerned about the threat to MPs, right? And now all of a sudden, people that are lobbying their MPs and demanding that their MPs are reflective of the British public view, right? Consistently since the 7th of October and predates 7th of October, the British public has always stood with Palestinians, right? And calls for a ceasefire have never went under 2/3 of British majority opinion, and poll after poll after poll has been conducted and showed that, right? And so in the face of that, these people are now being categorized as threats and mobs and intimidating. And so again, so you see that with Labour, how they're so willing to kind of, again, erode all sense of order, all sense of democracy, all sense of like our rights, again, in order to not change the public stance or the government's stance on Israel. And so I think what our response as a movement has to be is a couple of things. Firstly, to recognise the increase of state legislation for what it is, because the government know they can't win the public argument, and so what they do is they bring every state institution against us. Right? We've seen the way the police have been so brutal in the protests. We've seen how universities have clamped down on academics and students alike. We've seen how doctors have been expelled from their professions, from healthcare, for speaking up about Palestine. And again, the examples are endless upon endless. And so we have to recognise our job as a movement has to make this the broadest movement possible. We have to see the intersectionality of all the movements that come together. And this is precisely what scares them, right? They want to isolate us. They want to isolate the climate justice movement from the Palestine movement. They want to isolate the student movement from the Palestine movement. They want to isolate all these movements when in fact the fight is won. The fight is won, the battle is won, and we are all at risk when one of us has their rights stripped away, whether it's migrants and refugees, the most vulnerable in our society, whether it's pensioners, whether it's students, whether it's whoever it is, right? The moment one person or one group of people's rights are stripped away, then all of us are at risk, right? Because we have fewer than tools at the disposal to fight the next injustice, right? And so we have to make this the broadest coalition movement possible. And I think we've done such an incredible job at that, right? We've seen how everyone from all walks of life comes onto the protests, right? And our job is to reach out to those parts of society that previously aren't involved, and to make this the widest possible movement possible. And this is partly why, the Biden and Trump administration, again, same system, no difference between the Republicans or the Democrats, why they, again, fear this movement possible, and why, again, there's a massive underestimation of what this is. This is the biggest global movement the world has ever seen, right? When students here took inspiration from the encampments in America, when people in America were faced with tear gas, it was Palestinians in the West Bank that were teaching them how to confront police brutality, because they had all well seen it with the Israeli military. And so that interconnected solidarity and that global solidarity and that intersectional solidarity is something that the government doesn't want to see, and states don't want to see, and they see it as a threat. And so that's why it's important that we stand up for all those that were arrested previously on the 18th, and those that are continue to face previous to that. We have, as Steph mentioned, there are lots of political prisoners at the moment that we have to raise the alarm bell for, right? And we have to throw everything that we have at this. And I think very, very importantly, it's important that we don't get also distracted by these attempts that they keep pushing at us. You know, when we don't have to justify that, we don't have to sit and explain, for example, why shouting from the river to the sea isn't a call to annihilate anyone, right? We don't have to sit and justify why lobbying our MPs doesn't make us hate mobs and intimidation, right? Because again, these are all tactics that are attempting to distract us from the main conversation of our taxis are being used to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, right? They're being actively used to commit a genocide, right? And because the government can't win the argument of public opinion, it's throwing everything it has at us, right? And we have never been in such a more powerful position, and the government has never been in a more weaker position, by the way. The government didn't follow through with the ceasefire because out of its goodwill, and we saw that when David Lammy was on the phone to Netanyahu telling him that yes, the small percentage of arms exports that were revoked, he'll reinstate them, right? Because he didn't want to, right? And for all the talk about David Lammy and Starmer being lawyers and being being human rights lawyers and stuff, they know, right? We can't assume that they're ignorant of these arguments. They know fully well, right? And it's not about, it was never about kind of international order as we've seen, or Democrats or any of that sort. So we always we have to see this. They want us to see the moment that the only possible future is the one that they determine. And as a movement, our job has to be that we get to set the future of our movement. We get to set we get to raise the ceiling. We get to break the ceiling, right? There's no ceiling for us for the length of our movement. And we have to go from strength to strength. We have to defend the most vulnerable in our society. We have to stand against police brutality, and every single weapon that the state throws at us, and every single tactic that the state throws at us. And we can't isolate ourselves from each other within this movement. We have to build the broadest coalition possible, and that's the only way that we're going to win. Thank you.